Welcome back, everyone. I'll just allow a moment for the rest of you to grab your seats. I would say thanks for your patience as well. The interest in this conference has been enormous, which is why it's rather crowded, which means there's a little patience required at lunch and breaks. But thank you for bearing with us, and I hope you all managed to get something to eat. Now, our next session on people with disability and technology is being recorded by a crew from ABC's Big Ideas program, and it will be broadcast as part of a Big Ideas program in the next few weeks. So just bear with me while I introduce the panel for the radio listeners. I'm Alan Kirkland, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on people with disability and technology as part of the Australian Human Rights Commission's Conference on Human Rights and Technology. This discussion is being recorded for ABC's Big Ideas program. Now, we'll be exploring the lived experience of people with disability and technology, including both the challenges and opportunities created by technology. And to help us get to the heart of that discussion, we've got three excellent and engaging speakers. Please welcome them. On my far right, you'll see Australia's Disabilities Discrimination Commissioner, Alastair McEwin. Al is joined by Emma Bennison, the CEO of Blind Citizens Australia, and Dr. Manisha, Amin, the CEO of the Centre for Inclusive Design. We're going to start this session by playing a short clip from Microsoft, which shows how new technology can make the world more inclusive for people with disability.
On a smartphone, speech to translated text.
There are barriers to communication everywhere, but I think it's time we look at the barriers as opportunities.
A group wearing t-shirts, ability, imagine, build, enable.
To reach out to everyone.
And we're seeing this come to life. A woman with headset and a guide dog. Soundscape.
Soundscape fills in a lot of the mental map as you move.
Approaching intersection.
You can just put it in your pocket and go.
A man uses a wheelchair and computer. Eye control.
With ALS, you become locked in. But we see technology as a way to give back what ALS has taken away.
Touching icons on a tablet computer. Swift key symbols. Katie Struck.
There's no better feeling than to hear a child say something that they've wanted to say and the look on their face after they've been able to say it.
A teacher and student. Learning tools.
When it's reading, I see spaces between the words. And it's easy to focus on.
Anjay realized that here was something that could change his life.
AI is opening the door to a new wave of possibilities.
That video gave a brief overview of some of the ways that technology can enhance the rights of people with disability. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the audio descriptions that were playing during that video, they're just a very small practical example of technology playing a useful role. Over 1 billion people globally, approximately 15% of the world's population, have a disability. Almost 1 in 5 Australians, 18.3%, have a disability. The Australian Human Rights Commission receives more complaints of discrimination on the basis of disability than on any other ground, so it's more common than race, gender or age discrimination. And while we often talk about accessibility of buildings, the idea that everyone should be able to enter a hospital or school regardless of their disability, how good are we at thinking about how this applies to intangible environments online? That's what we're going to explore in this discussion. Now, towards the end of the discussion, we'll be fielding some questions from the audience that is here with us today, so please submit your questions online during the discussion. To get our discussion underway, Al, Manisha and Emma, I'd like to invite you to make a brief 2 to 3 minute opening statement, and perhaps in doing so you may care to reflect on some of your own experiences. Al, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Alan, and hello everyone. For me, one of the most amazing developments in technology as a deaf person has been the voice to technology. Up until last year, or rather earlier this year, if you rang my mobile number, or if you were hearing and you didn't know how to text with me, you could get a paging service. So there would actually be a human being who would say, Alastair McEwin phone, what is your message? And then they would type it and it would be sent to me as text. Fantastic. I then last year got a letter from my telecommunication provider saying we're stopping this service and converting to voice to text technology. And I was rather apprehensive because to date, the software and the capability to accurately 100% translate from voice to text was a bit and, not to my need. However, they implemented that service this year and it's been fantastic. There's still maybe 98% accuracy, but it's enough for me to know what the hearing person has said in their message. So in summary, we've come a long way, but we've still got to make sure we get that extra 2% to make sure that I don't miss out absolutely on what has been said in the hearing bill.
Emma.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, I'm very optimistic about technology in general terms. I love it. I'm excited by it. I also think that it excludes quite a lot of people, particularly older people, which are a large percentage of Blind Citizens Australia's membership. However, for me, in recent times, unquestionably, the game changer that has occurred probably only over the past 12 to 18 months, really, in terms of blindness technology, has been services like Be My Eyes, IRA and other similar services. And for people who don't know what they are, let me give you an example. This morning, I was staying at a hotel and I walked into the lift and lo and behold, there was no braille, not even any large print on the buttons, but then again, at least there were buttons. So I'm not complaining, it's great that there were buttons. I did have an experience of a touchscreen lift not too long ago, so I'm not complaining. However, I called IRA, which is a remote visual interpretation service for people who are blind or vision impaired, and that service at the moment is provided from the US. I called them up and I said, look, I'm in this lift, and I had to change to elevator because they didn't know what I was talking about. They thought I wanted to order a lift. So when we got that language issue sorted out, they said, I said, I'm in an elevator and I can't figure out where the ground button is because there's no tactile markings. And she said, you wear a pair of glasses or you can use your phone's camera. I had the glasses on. So she said, just tip your head forward a little bit. So I tipped my head forward. She said, yes, if you just move your finger up one button, you'll be on the ground button. And off I went. And then she was able to guide me out of the elevator and into the reception where I met my friend. So very exciting, totally game-changing. We talked before about the ability of technology to create an emotional response. And I have to say that probably not since the time that I got my first personal computer in 1988 have I experienced such a strong emotional response to a piece of technology as I have to this, because it really does spell liberation for me. I was able to, the other day, come out of an unfamiliar building, decide I wanted to go and have a coffee, call up IRA and go, I'd like to find a coffee shop nearby, and they were able to direct me to the coffee shop, help me find the counter, help me read the menu and help me find a table. Now, all of that might sound really simple to all of you, but for me, that was just incredibly liberating. And I have found myself, and I know many others in the community who I speak to have found themselves reduced to tears by this technology, just because it is such a freeing experience, because it's on your terms and in your time frames. So one of the things that worries me about it, and I will be finished in a minute, but one of the things that worries me about this technology, or that I think we need to be aware of, is that is it going to create complacency among our advocates? Is it going to mean that businesses, for example, say, IRA will help, or Be My Eyes will help. We don't need to make our touchscreen FPOS machines accessible. We don't need to provide audio description on television, or whatever the case may be. My answer to that question is, I hope that it will create energy in our advocates. I hope that the energy that we are all using to try and navigate the world at the moment, which is actually being saved by having services like IRA, will actually ignite our advocacy efforts and will give us more energy and more impetus to actually advocate for the things that are really important to us. So I put a positive spin on it, but I do think it's something we need to be aware of.
It's a fantastic intro. Manisha, would you like to add your thoughts to that?
So certainly I don't have the lived experience of either Alastair or Emma here, and I would like to acknowledge all the people in this room who have different experiences and different notions of inclusion, because I think that is where we start and finish this conversation, really, when we talk about ethics and value and design. talking about, I guess, what Emma just spoke about. In 10, 15 years ago, we had conversations about captioning, and captioning was something that was there for people who were blind. Sorry, not blind, for people who couldn't hear, people who were deaf. And we saw captioning as something that was for the disability community. If you think about, fast forward to now, how many of us sit in bed with our little computers and watch say, Game of Thrones with captions on so that we don't disturb the person next to us? Captioning is now something that is for everybody, but it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the disability and the community actually making a fuss about it in the first place. So when we talk about inclusive design, what we're really interested in is how do we take these big conversations around what is value, what does it mean to be human, what does bias look like, and actually bring it to the coding floor. And there are 3 ways that we look at that. The first way is by thinking about the people on the edges, and Todd Rose talks about this a lot. We tend to talk about averages, but actually no person is average. And when we look at the edges, we actually get a better sense of not only where the benefits are, but also where the problems are. We also look at co-design, and that's been spoken about a lot today. And the other side that I would like to talk a little bit about is the idea of systems thinking and how disability works with systems thinking. And the way I like to think about it is it's the canary in the mine shaft. So a good example for me is all of us in this room, I think, have at some point felt tired or fatigued. And we kind of think it's normal now, but it's actually a function of the volume of information we get and the technology that we see. It's become a hygiene factor. However, if we have the same conversation with somebody, and I'm going to use an example here of someone who's in the room who works with me, Jack, when he's in my office and he is using a screen reader and trying to get information, his cognitive load and the fatigue he faces is far more visible for all of us. So we're trying to design experiences and digital experiences and technological experiences that are beautiful for all of us. That's a piece of gold, that information, and that's what we'd like to see more of.
I'm interested in exploring this issue of how some of these positive changes come about, because each of you have spoken about positive changes that you've seen or opportunities that you see. Manisha, I mean, you talked about captioning coming about as a result of activism. Yes. I guess I'm interested, say, Al or Emma, is that how you see things coming about now? As we explored in another discussion today, are these changes coming about because of market factors, or is it the metal really on the activists and civil society to make sure that we see businesses changing their practices?
I think that part of it is about activism. I think also part of it is about universal design and the fact that many of our, quote, mainstream, unquote, technologies, for example, the iPhone is a classic example, have adaptive technology built into them from the ground up. So some of that is kind of, really, really changing the game for us in terms of access to technology. But I think, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the time it's, change is not happening as fast as we would like. I mean, you only have to look, for example, at that video that was just played then and the reference that was made to audio description afterwards. And, the reality is that we still don't have audio description on Australian television, while, other OECD countries do. And we're falling way behind. So there's an example of where we just haven't kept up. And activism, and changes to legislation and regulation are probably the only things that are going to change that, unless someone wakes up and goes, oh, gee, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Everybody else is doing it. Even New Zealand's doing it. So, what's going on? But, I think there are a whole range of factors that play into it. Part of it's legislation, part of it's timing, part of it's, business will to actually get it done. But in many cases, it's not happening. So, we just have to keep advocating and keep saying the same things over and over again and hope that someone listens.
And certainly, for me, I'm seeing almost a widening gap in some ways, or in some parts of the technological innovation, where people with disabilities are literally forgotten about when we're designing something, and then we see a great uptake of the technology and people with disabilities are once again left behind. And it's really important, in addition to the advocacy that Emma talked about, is to also think, how can this benefit everyone? I sometimes think when I see a new product or a new innovation, I think, what is so fantastic about that product that you don't want me or my friend and colleagues with disabilities to also be able to access? So absolutely, we need to think from the beginning, and how will this benefit everyone? It's also a little bit about, I guess, human behaviour, and when they see something that they want to use, they will take it up. A really powerful example is that when mobile phones first became prevalent, early 2000s, late 1990s, it was designed for hearing people, to call each other. There was also inbuilt into some of the new phones coming onto the market a text function, but it was optional. And then deaf people and the deaf community discovered it, and they literally drove the market to make sure that before plans were heavily focused on calls and the number of call minutes that you could get, and text messaging, who remembers 75 cents per text message? So now we have plans where data in texting is included as your standard. So it's really important to think, as Emma quite rightly pointed out, there has to be sustained advocacy, but at the same time, we also need to remember a lot of it is driven by the market. But having said that, we also need to remember why things were designed in the first place, and not to forget people with disabilities as we move down the path of new and more exciting technology.
It occurs to me we're talking about two broad categories of technology here. We're talking about, there have been some positive stories about technology design specifically for people with disability and how that's had a positive impact. We're also talking about technologies, I guess, designed for the general market, and where inclusive design may not be built into the process of developing those products. Now, Manisha, you're the CEO of the Centre for Inclusive Design, so you must spend lots of time thinking about this and indeed advising companies and organisations on that notion of inclusive design. How widely taken up would you say that way of thinking is in Australia?
It's interesting, tech companies get this better than other people. So I think a lot of tech companies understand that actually technology can work on an and model. So if you look at a phone, in the old days a phone was something that you had to pick up, and you had to either press buttons or dial, and that's all it could do. If you look at our phones today, we all use our phones in really different ways because they are individualised, and a lot of the technology companies get this. A lot of other companies don't. So there is actually a dichotomy there. What we also find is that, and I think we spoke about this a little bit in the morning, the policy teams sometimes make decisions on values and risk, but the tech teams aren't allowed to be part of that conversation. And it's often at the tech end and the engineering end that some of these conversations need to happen. So we often say that inclusive design is like the colliery that needs to sit around the design of technology and the STEM conversation that we're having at the moment. Because, and we've spoken a bit about bias today and discrimination. My belief is we'll always be biased. We'll always have the ability to discriminate, and so will AI. It's actually about looking at what those biases are and being transparent about them, and then making a decision rather than having it happen by mistake. Make sense?
Yeah, one thing you talked about there was the role of education. You're referring to the debate around STEM. I'm interested in your sense of how well we're educating people who design and build products to think about inclusive design. So when you're, I guess, dealing with developers in businesses and organisations, do they even know what you're talking about when you introduce that concept? Is it something that they've been trained to think about and apply?
It's interesting. So we often go in with a conversation about value, but what happens at the end of it is people see things they can't unsee, and they hear things they can't unhear, and that actually allows them to see design failures that they've never seen before. And the way we do it, it's not about me educating people on what inclusion looks like. It's about bringing the people who are not included into the room and having people engage and interact with them. Often when we talk about accessibility, we're talking about it from a perspective of can you know, can this technology be used with JAWS or can it be used with a screen reader? But people with disability are not a target audience. They're not a target market. They're all different. So we need to look at it from that perspective. So an example of that is, for instance, we were looking at an app, and this was actually in a hackathon, so this is not a conversation about any government department at the moment, but we were looking at an app around transport and buses. And did the app work from an accessibility perspective? Absolutely, and the person who tested it for JAWS and said, yep, this app is great. We then had somebody else test it, and the first person actually doesn't use buses very often. They actually use taxis. Second person was a student. They use buses, and they said, yeah, the app kind of works. And we said, well, what does that mean? And they said, well, it tells me that buses are coming, but when I'm at Wynyard Station and there's 10 buses there, I don't know which one is mine. It's about meaning. And you can't get that by sticking a hand behind your back and trying to play with a bit of technology. And that meaning is where the gold is.
And Emma, do you think this is happening very much? So among the communities that you represent, do you, are people being asked to turn up to test new products and services, to test apps, to test how well those products actually respond to their needs?
Yeah, I think it's happening, but I think there's two things I would say about that. One, it's not happening sufficiently. No, there's three things actually, sorry, I can't count. One, it's not happening sufficiently. Two, it's not happening in a contextualised environment. So for example, you know, you can test the functionality, it's like Manisha just said, you can test the functionality of something, but if you don't test it with the right people and in the right environment, for example, if you've got a device that's going to be used, say, in a coffee shop and you test it in a quiet room, well, you're going to get a different result, obviously. And then, you know, the third thing is that the testing happens far too late in the process. So by the time somebody asks one of our members or a group of our members, people who are blind or vision impaired, to go in and test a product, it's usually far too late for them to make any considerable, significant changes. The conversation really needs to happen at the very beginning of the design phase. That's where we see the biggest challenges. It's not that businesses aren't really committed to getting it right. They absolutely are for the most part. I would say the vast majority of businesses that we speak to are really committed to getting it right. The problem is that by the time they ask the questions, it's too late to get it right. And then they end up feeling terrible because they've fallen short, and people who are blind or vision impaired or people with disability generally miss out as a result. So it's about educating, you know, tech companies, but also businesses generally, to have the conversation early and often. You know, that's the important message here.
But there are two quick points that I would make in addition to what Manisha and Emma have talked about. Firstly, people with disability continue to be treated as objects of pity and, you know, that don't know what's best for them. People without disability constantly give us product or give us things, and we are told we know what's best for you. So we need to see less of that and more of, as Emma talked about, more of the testing and being involved right from the start. And leading on to my second point is around disability. We are also quite diverse. So, for example, Emma, if I can say so, and myself, we might be Emma's blind and I'm deaf, but our needs might be just, I'm getting them confused, but we might also have different needs from, you might meet somebody who's blind tomorrow who has completely different needs from Emma. So don't assume that if you bring in one person who's blind to do your testing, that you've ticked all the boxes. You absolutely haven't, and we've learnt from painful experience that we are still seeing product and innovation that are basically inaccessible to a wide range of people.
Al, how, I mean, you must, in your function as Disability Discrimination Commissioner, see complaints that make their way through the system. I'm interested in how big companies in particular respond when all of these problems that we've just described have played out and they've already got a really expensive app or website in the market, and it's found to have a really significant flaw in terms of disability discrimination or access. How do those sorts of businesses respond when they realise that's what's happened?
You're right, Alan. We do get complaints. So we get many complaints at the Commission around goods and services that are inaccessible. So, as you pointed out, websites are inaccessible, the telephone system is not accessible, even the smart devices that companies might roll out as part of the way they deliver services is not accessible. So we see many complaints, and where we've seen success is where respondents or service providers and companies have said, we're sorry this has happened. We are now going to do things like include people with disabilities in our testing and development. There was one complaint against a bank, and the complaint was around the ATMs not being accessible to people who were blind. And in the end, the complaint was resolved by the bank undertaking to do a wide range of things, testing of the ATM. For example, putting in headphone sets so that people who are blind can put on headphones and have what's on the screen read out to them. Tactile buttons on the ATM, and the list goes on. So that's an example of where we see a proactive response, and that we need to see more of that.
We have talked a lot about the role of big companies. I guess I'm interested in just delving a little bit into the startup world, because a lot of the debate in Australia is about innovation being driven by startups, by fintechs, by insurtechs, by whatever sort of tech it is. And we see some great things come out of that part of the world, but we also, when you get close to it, sometimes it's a bit like the Wild Wild West, bit of a cowboy culture. So I'm interested in thoughts that any of you might have around to what degree these issues are being thought about in the startup world, and whether you see that as being, on the whole, likely to make this better or make it worse.
I think my experience is that oftentimes, whilst startups may not have had the time or indeed the resources or capacity to think about it, what's great is that when you actually approach them, it's far easier to get to them. They'll actually, it's far easier to have a conversation and to be heard. But also, they're really, really keen to make their product or service the best it can be, and they will, generally speaking, from what I've experienced, go out of their way to do whatever they can. Whereas sometimes, and I'm not wanting to generalise here, but sometimes larger companies, are just too big and not agile enough in some cases to make the changes that need to be made in a timely manner, or even have the conversations that need to take place with the right people at the right levels of the organisation. You often end up having conversations with the legal team, which really is not particularly helpful, much as I, enjoy talking to lawyers, but it's not particularly helpful by that time.
I think we develop and we work with companies on inclusive agile projects. So how do you make your agile methodology inclusive? We look at the idea of MVPs. So there's this idea that a minimum viable product actually has to not include inclusivity. Actually, we say, well, let's hardwire that into your MVP. So there are ways of looking at the way people build now and making that normalised process inclusive. And I think that's the hardest and the easiest thing to do, in that if we use the way people currently work, if we use the way companies normally work, but we actually leverage the places where we can think about value and we can think about inclusion, that actually makes for a better world. And we often say it's about thinking slow to think fast. So certainly, if you think fast, yes, you might miss inclusion, and you might get your product to market faster, but the cost on the other side is not only, we think it's about 10 times greater to do the remediation work. So if we think slow to think fast, it's actually a lot easier.
Now, we have had some examples from the discussion so far about fairly ubiquitous technology that is in fact creating more barriers. So touchscreens have come up a few times. It's something that you mentioned in your opening, Emma, in terms of your experience using a touchscreen lift, I think. And Al, you mentioned the complaint involving a bank and ATMs. I'm interested in whether there are other technologies like that are in fact growing in their usage that might be causing even greater barriers.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about AI today, and I think there's many opportunities as well as obviously many, many challenges. And where I've seen it work well is where companies have appreciated the power of AI to help, for example, or assist people with cognitive disability to be able to access things like, and with all due respect to all the academics in the room, often we see academic articles that are quite, lengthy and with lots of jargon. And so IBM, for example, has created a program called Content Clarifier. And it enabled somebody with, say, a cognitive disability to do a range of things. They can click on a word and have that made more simple for them. They can actually summarise the article. They can even have the article translated into easy English. So this is a great example of where AI is assisting people with disabilities. So, but perhaps also think about the way we communicate. And if government and other service providers are insisting that we move toward a digital platform, we need to also remember the challenges for people, particularly with intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, dyslexia, and so forth. How can we harness AI and other software and hardware to ensure that they don't miss out on important information?
And Emma, do you have any other examples of where technology may be creating greater risks in terms of access?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples. I probably do need to go back to the touchscreen issue because, firstly, to say that touchscreens can be fantastic. I don't want to send the message in any way, shape or form that touchscreens are all bad and we should all avoid them at all cost. On the iPhone, for example, where there's good implementation of touchscreen accessibility, and also on Android phones these days, there's quite good implementation. They can be fantastic. The challenge arises when you've got, things like touchscreen banking products or touchscreen household appliances where there is no accessibility feature in place, or where the accessibility feature has not been well implemented, or where people are required to remember multiple different sets of gestures in order to achieve whatever they want to achieve that might take a sighted person 30 seconds. That's when it becomes a problem. So I think really the barrier is about making sure that there's consistency of implementation in terms of touchscreen devices, and that there are multiple entry points. There are multiple input methodologies. If you're going to have a touchscreen device, I applaud you. I think it's great. We all know that that's where technology is moving. Nobody's turning a blind eye. Sorry, that was a terrible pun to that. But I do think that if you're going to do that, you then also need to have other options, because for people who are ageing, for people with acquired brain injury, for people with MS, various other impairments that I could go on and name, touchscreens are difficult. It's not just people who are blind or vision impaired. In fact, my mother, who doesn't have a disability at all, complains bitterly about them every time she comes across them in the airport. She just can't deal with them. So, there always needs to be multiple entry points for people. I think that's the key thing. And if we don't do that, then we are creating barriers for lots and lots of sectors of our community.
All of this debate, of course, happens against a legal framework, primarily in Australia, the Disability Discrimination Act. How fit for purpose is it in dealing with these sorts of issues in the face of technology that's changing almost every day? Al, as the key administrator of that act, what would your perspective be?
Well, of course, fundamentally, we, as people with disabilities, have rights equal to others in the community. So we have the Disability Discrimination Act, as you pointed out. We also have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was ratified by Australia in 2008. And that enshrines the rights of people with disability to accessible technology, to access in general, and to make sure that companies and government have the mandate to provide technology in accessible format. So that's, of course, the law and the human rights framework. The reality, of course, is still very different, or still very much, we're still very much not seeing the realisation of those human rights for people with disabilities. And I indicated earlier, I think in some areas we're still actually, the gap is getting wider. So the challenge is for government to show leadership. They have in many ways demonstrated leadership through, for example, the National Disability Strategy, which includes accessible technology as one of its outcomes, but the reality has been much slower.
Emma, do you have any thoughts on whether the legislation is fit for purpose?
I do have some thoughts. You'll be surprised to learn. My thoughts are from the perspective of someone who spends quite a lot of time working with individuals, representing people, in the commission, but also as an individual who's lodged a number of complaints. And what I would say is that I want to preface this by saying I think it's fantastic that we have this legislation. It's absolutely imperative that we have this legislation. I think the challenge we face is how do we make it more user-friendly for people to go through this process. I mentioned before that advocacy is tiring, and I meant it. It is exhausting. The process is absolutely exhausting for people to have to go through. The onus is still on the person with disability to prove the discrimination. And that means that people are put in a position of vulnerability by the very nature of the process. People are made vulnerable to have to sit there and go through what happened and how it affected you and what you did and all of that. It can be quite traumatic for people. That having been said, the conciliation process, is a useful one when it works. But when it gets to a situation where people have no option but to go to court, that's not really a situation that is something we would want to see continue in this country if there's a better way of doing it. And I think really it comes back to my earlier point. If we can stop these issues before they get anywhere near the Commission, and if we can plan for access from the ground up, then that would certainly create a solution. But I think certainly there's been some successes, there's been some huge successes, and we've come a long way, in the last 25 years or so that the Act has been in force. But I think we do have some work to do around how we make sure that it's more user-friendly and manageable for people so that they don't burn out, because it is a really difficult process. There's no doubt about that.
Manisha, how important is the Disability Discrimination Act as a backdrop to the work that your centre does around inclusive design? Is it a significant motivator in businesses and organisations coming to you seeking advice, or is it really just there to pick up those who don't come to you in the first place?
I don't think it's I'll put it out there. I don't think it's a motivator at all at the moment, because it sits on the side. So it's just like every single other piece of regulation that people have to think of when they're thinking of this large complex thing that they're creating. And it just so do I think that it should be there? Absolutely. Do I think it should have more legs? Absolutely. But the reality is that when we're working in the market, the carrot works better than the stick. It works for all of us better than the stick. We know that positive psychology works better. So if there are ways, and quite frankly, if we had a world where people were creating for humans and for all humans, then Emma wouldn't have to fight the good fight. And we'd have better products. So we actually see that with companies that come to us, often they're saying, we want to actually disrupt the market. We want to understand where technology is going. We want to see how we can do this in a way that works for our business, and we want to actually engage with customers. And we say, that's great. Who are the customers you're missing at the moment? Where are they? How can we use that to innovate? And it changes the frame in a way that works for us as an organisation. I think for disability groups, when we talk with them and to them, that framework that Al is talking about is absolutely critical from a citizen's perspective.
Is there anything we can learn from any other jurisdictions, from other countries around the world, about the role of government in trying to drive change in terms of more inclusive technology and more inclusive design practices, so we don't have to fall back on legislation when something is poorly designed? Do you have any thoughts from the international arena, Al?
The moment in Europe, with the European Union, is actually currently discussing more legislation, more human rights framework around accessible technology, but they've separated it out of the mainstream framework and talked specifically about the need for technology to be accessible from, as Manisha has highlighted, from the beginning, from an inclusive design perspective. So that gives me hope that government and countries around the world are understanding where the core issue is, and it's at the beginning rather than as an afterthought, or rather as in something where, oh yes, we'll get to that at another time. So I can see some movement. What I'm also seeing is the power of social media. So, and we've all seen it, I'm sure, where if a product is not up to standard, Twitter, for example, will go into a meltdown, and you can now, of course, tag the company in question. So that also meant that the behaviour of companies and service providers is also changing for the better. But often we still don't see, as Emma's pointed out, that systemic change, and that's where we need to make sure that the system is better supporting people with disabilities to make systemic change.
Emma, do you have any thoughts? You must talk to similar groups overseas. Do you see places where they're doing better?
Yeah, look, well, I mean, absolutely. There are places where things are better, and there are developing countries where we look absolutely incredibly lucky by comparison, and we do need to remember that too. But I mean, I don't want to go on about audio description. Well, actually, I do. But I just can't get past the fact that all these other countries are doing it. So, many of them have legislated for it. And so, we're certainly lagging behind on the legislative front in that regard. But I do definitely agree with Al about the social media power too. But also recognising that, there are, and it's the same with our discrimination legislation, there are many people who, for whatever reason, don't use social media, can't access it. There are many people who would never in a million years go anywhere near the Human Rights Commission because they feel like it's not for them for whatever reason, or it's just too hard, or they just can't do it because of their circumstances. And it's those people that I worry about. It's the people who can't, for whatever reason, access the systems that we have in place. How do we make sure that those people are taken care of? And that's where I think, some other countries in relation to things like voluntary standards and guidelines, are getting it right, and legislation as well, more often than we are, certainly in terms of audio description. Sorry, I won't go on about that.
Sometimes you just got to keep talking about an issue until you get the change, so all power to you. I'm going to go to some of the questions coming through from the audience now. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the opportunities and how we harness those opportunities in terms of improving access. Some of the questions that are coming through are more about how we manage the risks. So one of them is, how do we make sure that people with disability and mental illness are not isolated due to technology and economic barriers, perhaps barriers that might be associated with technology? Manisha?
So I think this is where, when we look at our methodology around inclusive design, it's really bringing in some of those people at that stage of creation. So, and can we go back? The question was really
about how do we stop people being isolated? Yeah. So technology, I guess it's a great benefit is that it helps to connect people, but there's a risk that it can leave people more isolated.
And it does, and we've seen that happen. Time and time again. When we look at the way that we use and our methodology around this, what we're doing is not just saying, person with disability, come in and talk to us about what you do. We're actually going, okay, how do we use our senses, our being, our knowing? How do we actually interact with the technology? And what are we learning from that? Not from the average, but from the people on the edges. And when we look at big data around this, if we throw the data down, you often find the people for whom things are working well are in the middle, and they're all together, and they're all kind of similar. And as you go to the edges, actually all the people are quite different, and they're far away from each other. So when we actually do our iterative design, rather than going, let's have lots of ideas and bring them down to one cool idea, we go, let's have lots of ideas, and then let's bring in one of those edges and push things out that way. And then bring in another edge and push things out that way, so that we're actually including people in, if you like, a virtuous circle rather than a vicious cycle. And that's the way that we actually work to bring in those edges. It takes a little bit more time at the beginning, but what you get is something far, far more inclusive.
There is, Al, you were going to add something.
I wanted to add something. I was just going to say that I think one of the solutions I think testing, as we've talked about, is really important. I think inclusion from the ground up is really important. But I think one of the solutions actually lies in employment.
Yes.
And employment is one of the fundamental challenges we have as a community of people with disability and as a community in this country. The unemployment rates for people with disability are far too high. And in fact, we could kill two birds with one stone here, in fact. I mean, if we actually, employed people with disability in our organisations, and therefore that question of access was in our face every minute of every day, then I actually think we would solve a lot of the challenges that we currently face in terms of access being forgotten and being kind of an afterthought or a nice to have. I think if people are walking down the corridor and they suddenly run into a person with an intellectual disability or blind person or whatever, that's going to put it top of mind, better than any amount of testing or any amount of education or training will ever do, I can assure you.
Just on that, we've done some research around fear and shame, and one of the questions we asked was very much this question. The technology exists, the WCAG guidelines exist, design thinking and inclusive design exist, and we said to people, why isn't this happening? What's stopping this happening in the workplace? And what came up was this notion of fear and shame. And what that was when we unpacked it, was people saying, when I see someone with a disability, I'm nervous about what to say. I'm worried that I'll say the wrong thing. Because I fear saying the wrong thing, I actually walk away. We do it all the time. How many people have walked away from a homeless person or someone on the street, and you kind of have that funny feeling when we do it, but we do it. And then when we do that, we go, okay, now that we've walked away, I feel ashamed that I've walked away because that wasn't a very good thing to do. And when we feel shame, what do? We often bury it and we hide in a hole and we push it away, or we blame the thing that we were ashamed of in the first place. So the person experiencing disability is doubly disabled, not only by the function of the environment, but by the function of what happens with us. So by bringing people into the workplace, by removing some of that fear, we actually, it's like the Trojan horse in the design world. And it also means that we're actually dealing with all of us as humans.
In addition to talking about trying to make sure we don't have people with disability who are isolated, as the question asked, we also need to think about independent. How can we make sure that the technology we are developing create independent? So, moving away from where Emma talked about with her experience with, arriving at hotels and getting into elevators and so forth, but also think about the power of the technology. I know of a young man who lives up in the Newcastle region who is non-verbal, and through the NDIS he has a package where he now has an iPad with a speech processing program, and he's now running his own small business he delivers coffee to the local businesses. So he'll go around, take the coffee orders, goes to the cafe and then delivers the coffee. So not only is he being independent, he's contributing to the economy, and he's also satisfying our human right to coffee.
There is another question that's been quite popular among the audience here, which kind of goes to that issue of inclusion in a way, and in a way it questions the premise of this very discussion by saying, how can we ensure that the needs of people with disability are not segmented from the mainstream of discussion of technology and are included along consideration of other biases such as race and gender? So to what extent is it a good thing to be talking about disability separately, and to what extent do we need to join it up with the other discussion about some of the risks of, abuse of human rights through technology? Emma, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's important that we do both. I actually think that it's quite important that we talk about disability separately, because we've just finished a conversation that says that we're concerned that people might get forgotten. So I think it would be nice if we didn't have to, but I think until such time as we can be quite confident that we're not going to get left out of the equation, I think we do need to have a separate conversation. But there are also some very specific needs that people with disability have that that need to be addressed. So I think that's perfectly reasonable. But I also think that it's crucially important that we don't have a disability conversation over here and a mainstream conversation over there. And I think that technology is driving that, because in fact, technology, more and more mainstream technology is either becoming inherently accessible or looking for ways to become accessible. So I think, I don't really think that's too much of a concern. I think we need to be having both conversations, and they're for quite different reasons. But I'd be very concerned if we suddenly felt like we'd solved all the problems and we didn't need to have a conversation specifically about the needs of people with disability. I mean, unless we have solved all the problems, but from where I'm sitting, we most certainly haven't. So I think we need both.
Alastair, this must be something that you and Edward Santow, the Human Rights Commissioner who's leading this whole project on human rights and technology, must have thought about a bit in terms of how this project develops. How do you see the discussion around people with disability and technology playing out as part of this broader discussion in a human rights context?
Absolutely. I mean, Ed, to his enormous credit, has recognised that for people with disabilities, access to technology is a huge issue that we have in society. So I commend him and his team for the work that they've done. And it's been really good to have had many conversations, not only just about, as Emma was saying, to be involved, but at the same time understand the broader picture. And the broader picture is here, in this context of technology, is why are we developing something that would exclude people with disabilities? It's about how we can all be learning from each other, creating an inclusive community, but also thinking about the impact that it has on people with disabilities, such as lack of employment opportunities, lack of education, lack of access to community services. So the list goes on. So it's great to see this project being implemented, and I very much am very proud to be a small part of it.
There is a question. You mentioned the impact of the NDIS a little while ago, Al. There is a question that's come through about the NDIS, and specifically whether it's helping us to explore new and emerging technologies for people with disability. What would you say about that, Emma? Is the NDIS helping with these issues?
Look, there's two things I'd say. One is I think it's probably too early to say definitively whether it's helping or hindering. But I think what's important is that we need to keep in mind the premise of the NDIS being about choice and control. And I've heard many stories of people who have gone to get their NDIS plan and have been told that even though a piece of mainstream technology, such as, for example, an iPhone, might contain the adaptive technology they need to be able to do what it is they want to do in their life, that's been turned down on the basis that it's, quote, mainstream technology, unquote. So I think I'm really excited by the possibility that there could be a broader conversation with the National Disability Insurance Agency about what constitutes adaptive technology and what role the NDIA might play in looking at these and trialling these new technologies, such as the IRAs and other new technologies that are coming through, so that people can exercise real choice and control. Because real choice and control means that, notwithstanding that obviously the device or the piece of equipment has to be assistive, it has to be related to your disability, etc. But if that piece of equipment that's going to assist you most happens to be a piece of mainstream equipment, then that's perfectly legitimate. And I think that yeah, thank you.
It's a popular idea in the crowd.
But I do think that's really important, and I'm excited by I'm not at all suggesting that the NDIA isn't willing to have that conversation. I suspect it is, but I think that conversation needs to be had far more broadly across the disability community.
Manisha.
Just adding to that, I think we need to think about this. Choice and control is really important, and the one thing I would put onto that is also the notion of power. So where are decisions being made, and who has the ability to make that decision? So we want to be in a world where we have choices, and we actually have the power to have that choice ourselves, not have it made for us. And when we talk about NDIS, certainly the system gives us power, but choice and control, but the power actually rests with the person on the other side of the table who's passing out the money. And it's the same sort of conversation we have when we talk about privacy, the ability to have the right to be invisible, the right to actually know where our data is going, the right to be able to not have to tick a terms and conditions box with all sorts of things on it before we access a game. So this is where I think power sits with choice and control.
And quickly for me, I agree with Emma, it's too early after 5 years to say whether the NDIS is helping or hindering what we're trying to achieve in terms of human rights and technology. Having said that, the NDIA does have a co-design framework, so that's the big plus. So they've said the scheme is about people with disabilities. We're not going to run it without a co-design approach. They've also estimated that of the 22 billion that will be spent annually once it's fully rolled out, about 1 billion of that will be supporting packages or rather funding toward assistive technology. So that's a plus. However, as Emma pointed out, we need to make sure that we are monitoring the scheme to ensure that it is fulfilling its aims.
We've probably got time for one more question. Another one that was quite popular among the crowd was really about some of the risks involved in information that might be in game-changing technology. So what do you think about the risks in giving up information about yourself, perhaps location information about a person's access needs, the risks around who owns that data, and are they significant risks we need to worry about? And if so, how might we manage them?
So, my example here is a My Health example. And one of the things that I'm quite heavily involved with the ADHD community, and my sister is actually an epidemiologist. So we've been having a really interesting conversation about My Health and the risks of data. And I can see, and I've had medical people tell me that actually by having My Health work, we can save lives. We can have information that's together, and that we can actually have ways to actually help all of us. As a mother of a child who has ADHD and who sees the stigma associated with that, I go, I get that, but how's it going to impact on him? Where's the data going? I know where it's going today, but I don't know where it's going tomorrow. And I know that while I'm having that conversation as a mother of a child with ADHD, all of us in the community are having that same discussion at varying degrees. So I think we talked just a little bit about where does disability sit on the notion of women and race and gender, etc. When we look at that bell curve again, disability is on the edges. So women with disability on the edges, race and cognitive behaviour on the edges. So actually disability is always on the extreme, and we can learn from that for this.
Emma,
we need to remember, of course, that with any system, whether it's My Health or any other government or other system, whether it's opt-in or opt-out, people with disability need to have that information provided in an accessible format so that they can also make informed choice. They need to be supported to make informed decisions. So it's been interesting for me to watch the current debate around My Health records and whether it's opt-in, opt-out. And the one thing that's been missing from that is what about people with disabilities actually knowing what are they actually signing up for, or what are they actually consenting to or not consenting to?
I mean, there are certainly some issues with that. I guess for me, somebody made the comment before about the question of what price will you pay for convenience in terms of giving away your data, your information. And I kind of went, oh, no, it's not just about convenience. Sometimes it's actually about being able to get something done, like something really, really important done. And sometimes giving away my information is actually the only way I can get that thing to be accessible on that particular day at that particular time without waiting for a sighted person or whatever it is. So, it's a really difficult question. It's a really important question, but it's every single person's choice, I think. It comes back to choice and having the ability to say, yes, I understand what it is I'm doing here when I'm giving away this data or when I'm sharing this information. I understand the risks and, you know, I've decided to make whatever decision I've decided to make. But the important thing is that we actually know and we have the choice and we have an accessible way of finding out what those options are. Because if that's not the case, then I think, you know, we're all in a lot of trouble, not just people with disability, just all of us.
That theme of choice is an excellent place to end our discussion. Thank you for joining us for this discussion about people with disability and technology. And please join me in thanking our speakers, Disability Discrimination Commissioner Alastair McEwin, Emma Bennison from Blind Citizens Australia, and Manisha Amin from the Centre for Inclusive Design. A reminder that to read more about this program of work by the Australian Human Rights Commission on human rights and technology, you can visit tech.humanrights.gov.au. That's tech.humanrights.gov.au. Thanks again for joining us.